Hello, this is Volker Janssen with some feedback on your discussion board work. First of all, let me talk about some of the basics for this assignment. I really was looking forward to all of you discussing the question at hand, is the Electoral College preserving or ruining democracy or undermining democracy? I really wanted you to discuss this question with a look at history and the present situation. And that meant that I was hoping that all of you would reference both your history text and the reading of the Electoral College in the context of history, but also study what the role of the Electoral College is today. Very few of you actually made references to outside sources, which I so strongly encouraged. And in most cases then, it was not reference to newspapers, op-eds and articles describing maybe demographic changes that made the Electoral College interesting and worth discussing, but info pieces online that explained what the Electoral College is. You should, before you begin a discussion of the Electoral College, understand what the Electoral College is, of course. But that is not really where I would like you to make your references. I would like you to make references to maybe an opinion piece in a newspaper by a scholar or political scientist who then talks about the benefits or disadvantages of the Electoral College, not to a Wikipedia equivalent website that explains how the Electoral College works. That is sort of an assumption that I put out there, that you educate yourself on this. So that's the first thing. The second is that on the substance, I wanted a little more detail on why or why not you oppose the Electoral College. Over the course of the discussion, I could not see a significant development of the conversation. And the next time we do a discussion board, I'm really looking forward to you reading each other's posts and then departing from that common understanding of knowledge and moving forward. So rather than reiterating the same points again and again, try to then elaborate and move forward in the conversation. So I think at this point you may want to know what I think of the Electoral College. Historically, the Electoral College was meant to be a buffer between popular will and the executive. That meant that it was not a democratic institution. It was meant to dilute the democratic will of the people. And the way in which the Founding Fathers described this was mob rule. Today, when people talk about mob rule, it's a little suspicious because it suggests that there is people not worth listening to, people whose votes should not count because they're somewhat of a lower class. Now, all of us can imagine people that we find uneducated and whose opinions we find objectionable and whose votes we'd rather not count fully. However, democracy means that every vote counts, and it is not a matter of education whether your vote counts or not. So that particular argument for the Electoral College, that it protects us from mob rule, is as anti-democratic back then, and purposefully so, as it is not democratic today, and that is something we should embrace. Now, to counter that, in fact, today we are more educated, is not really offering the proper response, because we all know that today we have millions and millions of highly uneducated voters casting their ballot. That is nothing we can rightfully object to, because that is, as I said, part of the democratic process. But neither can we somehow claim that today we are far more enlightened. And I think all of us can think of examples in recent elections where we found that wisdom did not necessarily prevail. Now, the Electoral College was also built to strengthen the voices of smaller states compared to larger states. Some of you have argued that large states have many more Electoral College votes, but proportionately, any Californian or New Yorker or Texan has a smaller share of a voice in the Electoral College than someone, say, from Rhode Island or Wyoming. that essentially has to do with the fact that we began not as the American people in a singular, but as different American peoples, a plural. So it was New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, and whatever you call people from Connecticut that came together and built a confederation that was the original Constitution, and then made a stronger type of confederation. Think of the fact that until the Civil War, Americans often referred to these United States, not the United States. So the weight of every individual state mattered far more to the different Americans at the founding of the nation than it does for us today. The reason it has arguably less of a role for us today is because the federal government has grown in significance significantly, especially over the last 120 years or so. As late as the 1890s, a president like Grover Cleveland would answer the door to the White House himself. You would ring the doorbell at the White House, and there he would stand. And people could still go and visit Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s. The executive branch was not that important in the original design of the Constitution. It has become far more significant since World War I, the Great Depression and the New Deal, and certainly throughout the Cold War. So today the president is a major issue in national politics, which he, and that's where we stand today, there has still not been a woman president, which he takes today. Today, elections, when people think of national elections, they think of presidential elections. And they have become the center point of election campaigns, which was not the case in the 1860s and certainly not in the 1790s and early 1800s. So for that reason, it was less problematic back in the day to dilute the will of the people through the Electoral College. Because ultimately the selection of the president, and they called it a selection rather than an election, the selection of the president was really secondary to the election of the House of Representatives and the senators. Now there's another component that comes into your thinking about the Electoral College, and that is the way in which we now apportion Electoral College votes. California, any other state, they have House of Representatives plus the senators. That is the number of electors for every state, meaning House of Representatives plus 2. So for a small state, it is maybe one representative, as in the state of Montana, and 2 senators. In California, it is many more members of the House of Representatives, but still only 2 senators. So a California vote counts less in a presidential election, as a Californian counts much less in the Senate than, say, someone from Wyoming or Rhode Island. California has 2 votes in the Senate, and Wyoming, with the population of Riverside County, can easily nullify the weight of California in the Senate. And in a similar way, in the Electoral College, the votes from big states count less. Some put it the other way around and say, yes, the small states count more because otherwise they are so small and then they don't get counted. The question is, do we give weight to votes by territory, by state size, meaning a small state or in population a small state ought to count more than a big state? The inverse means that people in Los Angeles are a whole lot less important to us than people in Wyoming. Why do we have that bias? It's certainly an original bias from the Founding Fathers, as I said, because they thought of different states put into a confederation of sorts to build this new nation. But for us today, we have to be frank and say this is not a purely democratic process. To weigh someone from Nebraska, Hawaii, or Rhode Island more heavily than someone from New York, Texas, or California is not purely democratic. And then when you think this further and consider the fact that large states have more heavily metropolitan areas, and that heavily metropolitan areas are more likely to be racially diverse, one argument you could make is that in the end, the Electoral College weighs rural white votes more heavily than non-white urban votes. And that is a trend that we will see become more dramatic and more pronounced over the next 10, 20, 25 years, which is why I shared an article with you that described the demographic trend where within the next 20 years or so, half of the population will live in just, I believe, 8 states. You can look up that article. I'm just talking off the cuff here. So those were the considerations that I wanted you to make. Some of you made these points. For a lot of you, you did not move significantly past sort of a very straightforward reading of what the Electoral College is supposed to do. So those are my thoughts on this. Keep this in mind for the next discussion board, and have a good day. Take care.